Hey everyone, tonight we're uncovering history's greatest intellectual crime, the systematic destruction of ancient wisdom that set humanity back over 1,000 years. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover what knowledge was deliberately erased from human memory, and let me know in the comments if you've ever wondered why the Dark Ages were actually dark. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore how the rise of Christianity didn't just change what people believed. It burned the libraries, murdered the scholars, and eliminated entire sciences of consciousness that we're only now beginning to rediscover through archaeological accidents and hidden manuscripts. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The bone needles pierce the clay tablet while the scribe's hands tremble, not from fear, from reverence. In the flickering oil lamp light of ancient Babylon, sacred mathematics flows from stylus to cuneiform, each mark a prayer to Marduk, each calculation a key to unlock heaven's geometry. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, and this man, priest, astronomer, magician, captures their whispers in wet clay that will outlive empires. But tonight, he does not know that his world is already dying. Before the cross cast its shadow across the Mediterranean, knowledge belonged to the gods. In temple complexes that stretched like stone cities toward the sky, priest-scholars tended libraries that were not mere repositories of information, but living organs of divine wisdom. Here, in these marble halls and cedar chambers, the ancients wove together what we have since torn apart: science and spirit, mathematics and magic, healing and holiness. The Babylonian star priests climb their ziggurats at midnight, clay tablets clutched against their robes. They do not simply observe the planets, they commune with them. Each celestial movement carries meaning, each conjunction whispers prophecy. Their mathematical precision rivals our modern calculations, yet every equation pulses with sacred purpose. They track Venus not merely to predict eclipses, but to decode the intentions of Ishtar herself. In Egypt, where the Nile's floods have carved time itself into seasons, temple scribes bend over papyrus scrolls by lamplight. Their hands move with surgical precision as they record the secret names of plants that heal, the proper angles for pyramid construction, the exact words that must be spoken to guide souls through the underworld. The Edwin Smith papyrus details brain surgery techniques that would not be rediscovered for millennia. Yet every cut of the physician's knife is accompanied by incantations to Thoth. Medicine and magic dance together in these texts, inseparable as flesh and bone. The sound of bronze on stone echoes through Irish forests as druids carve ogham marks into standing stones. Each line and notch corresponds not only to a letter, but to a tree, a season, a sacred story. The oak represents strength and endurance. The willow speaks of moon dreams and water wisdom. These are not mere alphabets, but entire cosmologies compressed into elegant marks. The knowledge lives in the trees themselves, whispered through leaf rustle and bark pattern, teaching those who know how to listen. In Mesopotamian temple schools, young acolytes learn to see numbers as living entities. The sacred geometry that builds their temples is the same mathematics that governs planetary motion, that determines the proper proportions for ritual vessels, that calculates the exact moment when gods are most likely to listen to human prayers. They understand what we have forgotten, that mathematics is not merely a tool for measurement, but a language for speaking with the divine. The Etruscan haruspices slice open the warm bellies of sacrificial animals with bronze knives that catch firelight like liquid gold. But they are not primitives, groping in entrails. They are reading a sophisticated divinatory system that influences Roman military campaigns and political decisions. The liver's lobes correspond to regions of the heavens. Its color and texture reveal the will of the gods with the same precision that modern meteorologists read weather patterns. When they speak of finding the house of Jupiter within the organ's folds, they describe a complex theological geography that Roman generals trust with their lives. The Greek philosophers gather in marble colonnades where shadows shift like sundials across geometric mosaics. Here, Pythagoras teaches that numbers themselves are sacred, that the harmonies of music reflect the eternal mathematics governing celestial spheres. Plato describes geometric forms that exist in perfect realms beyond material reality. These are not abstract theories. They are mystical practices, ways of using rational thought to touch the divine mind. Every theorem becomes a form of prayer, every proof a step closer to understanding the god's design. At Eleusis, initiates descend into underground chambers where torchlight flickers across frescoed walls depicting Persephone's return from darkness. Here, the greatest minds of Greece, Plato, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, experience mysteries that transform their understanding of life and death. The exact rituals remain unknown, for the penalty for revealing them is death, and the Greeks keep their promise of silence across centuries. What texts existed to guide these ceremonies? What sacred dramas were performed? What substances induced the visions that participants described as more real than waking life? All this vanishes with the secrecy that protected it. The Celtic Druids commit entire libraries to memory, for they believe that sacred knowledge, written down, loses its power. For 20 years, students memorize poetry that contains astronomical calculations, legal precedents, healing formulas, genealogies reaching back to gods and heroes. When these human libraries die without passing on their knowledge, entire cosmologies evaporate like morning mist. The Romans will hunt these walking repositories of Celtic wisdom with the same determination they used to conquer cities, understanding that to kill a druid is to murder not just a man, but an entire world's way of knowing. In Mesopotamian temple complexes, astronomical libraries stretch across multiple buildings. Their cuneiform tablets containing star maps that track celestial cycles spanning thousands of years. Here, priest astronomers compile the ephemeris tables that predict eclipses centuries in advance, calculate the precession of equinoxes, and maintain calendars that govern agricultural cycles across the ancient Near East. Each tablet represents decades of observation, mathematical calculation, and divine inspiration compressed into wedge-shaped marks in clay. But knowledge in the ancient world does not flow through books alone. It pulses through the living earth itself. Egyptian physicians know which plants gathered at dawn contain different properties than those harvested at midnight. They understand that the same herb picked during different moon phases will heal different ailments. That copper implements conduct not just electricity, but spiritual energy. That certain stones placed on specific body points can redirect the flow of life force through human flesh. Celtic healers read the language written in leaf patterns, in the color of morning urine, in the way animals behave before storms. They know that willow bark eases pain not merely because of its chemical compounds, but because the willow tree weeps for human suffering and shares its sorrow wisdom with those who ask properly. Every plant becomes a teacher, every stone a counselor, every stream a source of both physical and spiritual healing. The Roman augurs stand on temple steps at dawn, reading the flight patterns of birds with the same precision modern scientists use to analyze particle trajectories. They understand that the natural world speaks constantly, through thunder, through animal behavior, through the patterns of oil spreading on water. Their divination is not superstition, but sophisticated pattern recognition, a science of meaning that sees the interconnection between human decisions and cosmic forces. In these ancient worlds, the universe itself pulses with consciousness. Stars are not distant nuclear furnaces, but living beings whose movements influence earthly events. Planets are not celestial rocks, but gods walking their eternal paths across heaven's dome, their positions at birth determining human personality and fate. The earth breathes with seasonal rhythms that must be honored through ritual, ceremony, and careful attention to natural cycles. Egyptian priests calculate the exact moment when Sirius rises with the sun, for this stellar event triggers the Nile's flood and marks the new year. Their astronomical observations serve both practical and spiritual purposes, predicting agricultural cycles while honoring the goddess Isis, whose tears cause the rivers rise. The same knowledge that ensures grain harvests also maintains proper relationship between human and divine worlds. Greek mystery schools teach that the soul itself follows mathematical principles, that personality types correspond to geometric shapes, that the journey after death can be mapped using the same calculations that predict planetary motions. What we call psychology and astronomy are aspects of a single science of consciousness that sees divine patterns operating from the smallest human heart to the largest celestial sphere. In temple libraries across the ancient world, priest scholars tend collections that will never be catalogued by modern standards because they refuse to separate sacred from secular knowledge. Medical texts contain prayers because healing involves more than physical intervention. Astronomical calculations include ritual instructions because observing the stars requires spiritual preparation. Legal codes reference mythological precedents because justice must align with cosmic order. These ancient keepers of wisdom understand something that the coming centuries will forget: that knowledge itself is sacred, that learning requires reverence, that wisdom cannot be separated from the context that gives it meaning. They see no contradiction between empirical observation and mystical experience, between rational calculation and divine inspiration, between practical application and spiritual transformation. But already, in the growing Christian communities scattered across the Roman Empire, new voices whisper different truths. They speak of books that lead souls astray, of wisdom that serves demons rather than the one true God, of knowledge that must be destroyed to save humanity from itself. The oil lamps flicker lower in the temple libraries. The priest scholars bend over their scrolls and tablets, copying sacred texts that have been preserved for centuries, adding new observations to astronomical records that stretch back to the birth of civilization. They do not know that time itself is running out, not just for them, but for the entire way of understanding that they represent. Outside, in the Christian churches, congregations gather to hear readings from holy books that proclaim the wisdom of this world foolishness in God's sight. They pray for the day when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that their God alone is Lord. They sing hymns that celebrate the overthrow of false wisdom, the casting down of lying spirits, the purification of a world corrupted by demonic knowledge. The darkness gathers around the edges of the ancient world like shadows creeping across a sundial. Soon, the flames will come for the books. Soon, the temples will fall silent. Soon, the last guardians of the old wisdom will speak their final words before the new age swallows their voices forever. But tonight, in the flickering lamplight, the knowledge still lives. Tonight, the priest scholars still tend their sacred libraries, still teach their students the mysteries that connect earth to heaven, still preserve the wisdom of ages in careful script and devoted memory. Tonight, the gods still walk among their people, and the ancient world still dreams its dreams of meaning. The marble steps are still warm from the Mediterranean sun when the scholar climbs toward the great door of Alexandria's Mausion. His sandals whisper against stone worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims seeking wisdom. In his arms, he carries a papyrus scroll containing calculations that map the circumference of the earth, mathematics so precise they will not be equaled for 1,000 years. Behind him, the harbor gleams with ships from every corner of the known world, their holds heavy with more than grain and gold. They carry scrolls, tablets, and codices, the accumulated wisdom of humanity flowing toward this single point of light beside the sea. Inside the Mausion, oil lamps burn through the night in chambers where scholars dissect human corpses to understand the flow of blood, where astronomers calculate planetary motions using bronze instruments that rival modern precision, where mathematicians develop geometric theorems that will reshape philosophy itself. This is not merely a library. It is a living organism of knowledge, a place where the boundaries between disciplines dissolve like salt in water. But already, in distant Palestine, a carpenter's son speaks of a different kind of wisdom. His followers gather in small rooms, sharing bread and wine, while whispering that the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. The great archives of the ancient world stand like lighthouses in an ocean of darkness, each one a repository of secrets that took millennia to gather. In Alexandria, the Mausion complex stretches across multiple buildings, connected by colonnaded walkways where scholars debate under painted ceilings that depict the cosmos as the ancients understood it, layer upon layer of crystalline spheres carrying planets and stars in their eternal dance. Here, Eratosthenes measures the Earth's circumference using nothing but shadows and geometry. Aristarchus proposes that the Earth revolves around the Sun, 15 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilus dissects cadavers in marble halls, cooled by sea breezes, mapping the nervous system with surgical precision, while chanting hymns to Apollo the healer. Each discovery emerges from a worldview that sees no separation between scientific inquiry and sacred practice, between rational investigation and divine inspiration. The scholars who tend these halls understand themselves as priests serving knowledge itself. They perform rituals before beginning their investigations, offer prayers to Thoth and Hermes for wisdom, and structure their research according to celestial cycles. When they measure the distance to the moon, they do so not merely to satisfy curiosity, but to understand their place in the cosmic hierarchy that connects earthly events to heavenly movements. In the papyrus workshops attached to the library, scribes copy texts with reverent precision. Each scroll requires months of labor, preparing the writing surface from Nile reeds, mixing inks from minerals and plants, carefully transferring letter-by-letter works that preserve the thinking of centuries. The Babylonica of Berossus contains 3 books of Mesopotamian cosmology and history, written by a priest of Marduk who had access to cuneiform archives stretching back thousands of years. Manetho's Egyptica records Egyptian dynastic history based on temple records that trace pharaonic bloodlines to the gods themselves. These works will vanish so completely that only fragments survive in later quotations, like echoes of voices calling across an abyss. Across the Mediterranean, in Pergamon's terraced library, scholars tend a collection that rivals Alexandria's holdings. Here, on parchment made from carefully prepared animal skins, copyists preserve the complete works of Greek philosophers, medical treatises that describe surgical procedures unknown to later ages, and astronomical texts that calculate eclipses with supernatural accuracy. The library's reading rooms overlook valleys where temple prostitutes once served Cybele, where mystery religions celebrated the death and resurrection of divine kings, where the ancient wisdom traditions of Anatolia merged with Greek rational thought to create new forms of sacred knowledge. But these monuments to human learning stand vulnerable in ways their builders never imagined. Knowledge preserved in books can be destroyed more easily than knowledge held in living memory, more completely than wisdom embedded in landscape and ritual. The very literacy that makes these great libraries possible also makes them targets for those who would redefine truth itself. In distant Ctesiphon, Zoroastrian fire temples house archives that contain astronomical observations compiled over centuries by Persian magi. These priest astronomers track celestial cycles with mathematical precision, recording planetary conjunctions, calculating the precession of equinoxes, maintaining calendars that govern both agricultural and religious activities across the Sassanid Empire. Their texts combine observational astronomy with theological speculation, seeing in stellar movements the eternal battle between light and darkness that Zoroaster revealed to his followers. The sacred fires that burn perpetually in these temples do more than honor Ahura Mazda. They provide the steady light by which scholars copy and preserve texts that bridge the gap between earthly science and divine wisdom. Here, Greek mathematical techniques merge with Babylonian astronomical data and Persian religious philosophy to create synthetic knowledge that will influence Islamic scholarship for centuries to come. But even these Eastern archives face threats that their guardians cannot foresee. Christian missionaries penetrate deeper into Persian territories with each passing decade, carrying with them a conviction that all non-Christian wisdom serves demonic powers. They speak of books that must be burned to purify the world, of temples that must fall to make way for churches, of ancient wisdom that must die so that true knowledge can be born. The Celtic Druids of Britain and Gaul maintain their vast oral libraries in grove sanctuaries where oak trees older than Rome whisper with wind voice the genealogies of heroes, the healing properties of herbs, the legal precedents that govern tribal disputes. For 20 years, Druidic students memorize poetry that contains compressed libraries of practical and mystical knowledge, astronomical calculations embedded in seasonal myths, medical formulae hidden within stories of divine healers, legal codes disguised as tales of legendary judgments. When Roman legions march through Gallic forests, they target these human repositories with systematic brutality. Suetonius Paulinus leads his soldiers onto the sacred island of Mona, where Druidic colleges have trained Celtic intellectual elites for centuries. The Romans burn the sacred groves not merely to crush rebellion, but to murder memory itself. Each Druid killed carries to his death entire libraries of oral knowledge that can never be recovered or reconstructed. The Druids understand what the Romans only dimly perceive, that in a culture based on oral transmission, killing the keepers of knowledge accomplishes what burning libraries achieves in literate societies. The myths, laws, genealogies, healing formulae, and astronomical observations that Druids carry in their memories represent the accumulated wisdom of Celtic civilization, stretching back to its origins. When these walking libraries die, entire ways of understanding the world die with them. In Carthaginian libraries, before Roman hatred reduces the city to ash and salt, Punic scholars preserve texts that bridge African and Mediterranean traditions. Here, Phoenician maritime knowledge merges with North African astronomical observations and Egyptian medical techniques to create synthetic wisdom traditions that will never be recovered. The complete destruction of Carthaginian civilization eliminates not just a political rival, but an entire intellectual tradition that had developed sophisticated approaches to navigation, agriculture, medicine, and philosophy. The few Carthaginian texts that survive do so only in Greek or Latin translation, stripped of their original context and theological framework. We know that Carthaginian astronomers made precise observations of southern skies invisible to Mediterranean observers, that their physicians developed surgical techniques for treating wounds inflicted by desert warfare, that their philosophers created sophisticated theories about the relationship between African spiritual traditions and imported Greek rational thought. All of this vanishes when Roman soldiers systematically burn every library, school, and temple in the burning city. In the mystery schools scattered across the Greek world, initiates preserve secret teachings that can never be written down without losing their power. At Eleusis, the sacred drama that transforms participants' understanding of life and death requires precise ritual knowledge passed from hierophant to successor through centuries of unbroken tradition. The exact words spoken during the telestai, the specific substances used to induce sacred visions, the symbolic meanings embedded in ritual actions. All this exists only in the minds and hearts of those who have experienced the mysteries firsthand. These unwritten libraries prove even more fragile than their papyrus counterparts. When the last hierophant dies without passing on the complete tradition, when Christian emperors close the sacred sites, when the social structures that support mystery religions collapse under pressure from new religious authorities, entire cosmologies evaporate without leaving physical traces. The profound spiritual technologies that transformed the consciousness of antiquity's greatest minds, vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The temple libraries of Egypt preserve texts that reach back to the very origins of written knowledge. In underground chambers beneath the pyramids, priest scholars tend archives that contain the collected wisdom of dynasties reaching back 3,000 years. Medical papyri describe surgical procedures performed with bronze instruments that demonstrate anatomical knowledge not rediscovered until the Renaissance. Astronomical texts calculate stellar positions with precision that requires centuries of careful observation. Mathematical treatises explore geometric relationships that form the foundation for pyramid construction and temple architecture. But these sacred archives face a particularly insidious threat. Christian monks seeking to preserve classical learning while purging it of pagan content copy selected Egyptian texts while destroying the theological frameworks that give them meaning. Medical knowledge survives separated from the spiritual practices that originally surrounded healing. Mathematical techniques are preserved while the sacred geometry that connected earthly proportions to divine harmonies disappears. Astronomical observations continue while the astrological interpretations that linked celestial movements to earthly events are condemned as demonic superstition. In the great library halls of Heliopolis, priest astronomers maintain records of stellar observations that stretch back to the beginning of recorded time. Their texts track the slow precession of equinoxes, calculate the exact length of the solar year, and predict eclipses centuries in advance. But this astronomical precision serves religious as well as practical purposes, timing temple ceremonies according to stellar positions, aligning sacred architecture with celestial movements, ensuring that ritual actions occur when the gods are most receptive to human prayers. When Christian authorities condemn astrology as devil worship, they destroy not just superstition, but sophisticated sciences that had developed over millennia. The priest astronomers who tend these libraries understand relationships between celestial mechanics and terrestrial events that will not be rediscovered for more than 1,000 years. Their texts disappear not because they are wrong, but because they are too dangerous, too connected to worldviews that see divinity operating through natural processes rather than transcending them. The shadows lengthen across the ancient world as new voices grow stronger in the cities and towns that surround these islands of learning. In Christian communities scattered throughout the Roman Empire, believers gather to hear readings from scriptures that promise the overthrow of worldly wisdom, the casting down of false gods, the purification of knowledge contaminated by demonic influence. They pray for the day when every book that serves Satan will be consumed by holy fire, when every temple that houses lying spirits will be torn down stone by stone, when every teacher of false wisdom will be silenced forever. Their prayers rise like incense toward a heaven they imagine purged of the planetary gods, cleansed of the stellar influences, emptied of everything except the one true God who tolerates no rivals. In the great libraries, the oil lamps burn lower as night deepens. The scholars bend over their scrolls and tablets, copying texts that preserve the wisdom of ages, adding new observations to records that stretch back to civilization's dawn. They work with the dedication of those who serve something greater than themselves, who understand their role as guardians of humanity's accumulated knowledge. But outside in the darkness, other guardians keep different vigils. Christian watchmen patrol the streets of cities where pagan temples still stand, marking which buildings house forbidden books, noting which scholars still teach dangerous wisdom, preparing lists of texts that must be destroyed when the time of purification comes. The ancient libraries stand like islands of light in a rising sea of darkness, their treasures glowing in lamplight that will soon be extinguished forever. The scrolls rest in their storage chambers, the tablets lie stacked in their archives. The memory keepers tend their vast oral collections, all unaware that the world they serve is already passing away. that the wisdom they preserve with such devotion has been marked for destruction by forces they cannot yet comprehend. Soon, the flames will come for the books. Soon, the hammers will fall on the temples. Soon, the last voices of the ancient world will speak their final words before silence swallows everything they knew, everything they preserved, everything they died trying to save. The bronze scales tip in Constantine's hands as he weighs gold against salvation. In the palace chambers of Constantinople, where purple silk drapes filter sunlight through windows that overlook 2 continents, the emperor, who once worshipped Sol Invictus, now kneels before the Christian cross. The year is 312, and with his victory at the Milvian Bridge, everything changes. Not just the empire's religion, but the very nature of knowledge itself. In temples across the Mediterranean, priest-scholars continue their ancient work, unaware that each scroll they copy, each ritual they perform, each student they teach, now marks them as enemies of the new order. The oil lamps that have burned in these sacred halls for centuries will soon be extinguished forever, their flames replaced by bonfires that consume the wisdom of ages. Constantine's conversion sends tremors through the foundations of the ancient world, like an earthquake that begins in the palace and spreads to every corner of the empire. What had been a persecuted sect becomes the favored religion of the most powerful man on earth. What had been whispered prayers in hidden rooms become imperial edicts thundered from marble steps. What had been the hope of the powerless becomes the weapon of the mighty. The emperor's hands are still stained with the blood of his rivals when he calls the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the empire to define Orthodox Christian belief. But even as they debate the nature of Christ's divinity in marble halls cooled by Bithynian breezes, other councils meet in shadow, gatherings of Christian leaders who understand that theological victory requires more than winning arguments. It requires silencing the voices that speak for older gods, burning the books that preserve different truths, destroying the very possibility that alternative wisdom might survive. In Egypt, where the Desert Fathers have retreated to caves and monasteries to escape a world they consider corrupted beyond redemption, new forms of Christian militancy take root in the burning sand. These ascetics, who flagellate their flesh and starve their bodies in pursuit of spiritual purity, look upon the great library of Alexandria with eyes that see only abomination. The scrolls that preserve Greek philosophy, Egyptian magic, Babylonian astronomy, all of it represents the poisoned wisdom of a world that crucified their Lord. Anthony of Egypt, whose visions of demons dancing in the desert sands inspire thousands to follow his path of radical rejection, preaches that the devil's greatest weapon is not lust or pride, but knowledge itself. The serpent's promise that eating from the tree will make humans like gods. His followers listen with the fervor of soldiers receiving battle orders, understanding that their war against the flesh extends to war against every book, every idea, every tradition that originates outside their sacred texts. The legal framework for intellectual destruction begins with seemingly minor adjustments to imperial law. Constantine himself issues edicts that seem almost gentle in their language, requiring pagan priests to cease certain practices, restricting access to temple treasures, encouraging the conversion of prominent pagans through offers of imperial favor. But legal scholars, who understand the machinery of Roman law, recognize these measures as foundation stones for more comprehensive destruction. By the time Theodosius I ascends to the purple in 379, the gentle encouragement has become systematic persecution. His edict of 391 strikes like a sword through the heart of the ancient world. Every pagan temple must close. Every sacrifice must cease. Every ritual that honors the old gods becomes a capital crime. The law's language carries the precision of administrative efficiency and the passion of religious warfare. No one shall approach the shrines. No one shall walk through the temples. No one shall revere the images. But Theodosius understands that closing temples accomplishes only half the victory. Knowledge can survive the destruction of buildings if the books that preserve it remain intact. His legal advisors, many of them Christian scholars who have studied pagan texts extensively enough to know their power, craft supplementary legislation that targets the intellectual foundations of the old religions with surgical precision. The Theodosian Code, that massive compilation of imperial law that will govern the Eastern Empire for centuries, contains provisions that make possession of certain books a crime punishable by death. Astrology becomes treason, not because reading the stars threatens the emperor's person, but because it represents a world view that recognizes divine authorities other than the Christian God. Divination becomes sedition, not because prophecy challenges imperial policy, but because it assumes that gods other than Christ might reveal the future to human seekers. In the markets of Ephesus, where Paul once preached to craftsmen who made silver shrines for Artemis, bonfires now consume books with the regularity of seasonal festivals. The Acts of the Apostles had recorded an earlier burning in this same city, when new Christian converts brought their magical books and burned them publicly, the value of the destroyed volumes reaching 50,000 pieces of silver. But that earlier conflagration was voluntary, an expression of religious enthusiasm by believers who chose to sacrifice their possessions for their faith. These new fires burn with different intensity. Imperial agents move through the city with lists of prohibited texts, searching libraries, private homes, and merchant stalls for works that contain forbidden knowledge. The books they seize represent centuries of accumulated wisdom, medical treatises that describe surgical procedures, astronomical texts that calculate planetary motions, philosophical works that explore the nature of reality through rational inquiry. The smoke that rises from these pyres carries with it the essence of entire intellectual traditions. Greek natural philosophy, with its careful observations of physical phenomena and its logical analysis of cause and effect, becomes indistinguishable from demon worship in the flames. Egyptian religious texts, with their sophisticated understanding of consciousness and their detailed maps of post-mortem existence, crumble into ash that the Mediterranean winds scatter across waters that will never again carry ships laden with such cargo. The Council of Laodicea convenes in 363 with the specific purpose of defining the boundaries between acceptable and forbidden knowledge. The bishops who gather in this Phrygian city understand that Christianity's triumph requires more than converting pagans. It requires transforming the very categories through which humans organize their understanding of reality. Their canons read like military orders issued by an occupying army. Christians are forbidden to consult astrologers or diviners. Christians may not participate in pagan festivals, even as cultural celebrations stripped of religious content. Christians cannot study the movements of planets and stars for any purpose other than practical navigation or calendar keeping. The systematic knowledge that had connected celestial observations to terrestrial events for thousands of years becomes not merely wrong, but evil, a form of collaboration with demonic forces that seek to deceive humanity about the true nature of divine power. But the most crucial prohibition targets the written word itself. Christians are forbidden to possess books that contain magical formulas, astrological calculations, or divination techniques. The penalty for violating this canon extends beyond excommunication to civil prosecution under imperial law. Possession of a grimoire becomes equivalent to treason against both divine and earthly authority. The emperors who succeed Theodosius expand these legal restrictions with the methodical thoroughness of administrators who understand that cultural transformation requires attention to detail. Arcadius issues edicts that specifically target libraries attached to pagan temples, requiring their contents to be inventoried by Christian officials who determine which texts may be preserved in monasteries and which must be destroyed immediately. Honorius extends these provisions to private libraries, authorizing searches of wealthy households suspected of harboring forbidden books. The legal precedent established by these searches will echo through later centuries, when inquisitors pursue heretical texts with similar systematic determination. In the palace chambers where these edicts are drafted, Christian advisors work by lamplight to compile lists of prohibited authors, forbidden subjects, and dangerous ideas. Their catalogues read like intellectual death warrants. Iamblichus the Neoplatonist, whose works on theurgy describe techniques for achieving direct communion with divine beings. Apollonius of Tyana, whose biography presents him as a miracle-working sage who rivals Christ himself. Zosimus of Panopolis, whose alchemical texts promise spiritual transformation through manipulation of matter. These are not merely academic exercises in theological precision. Each name on these lists represents hundreds or thousands of texts that must be hunted down and destroyed, along with anyone who possesses, copies, or teaches from them. The scholars who compile these catalogues understand that they are designing the intellectual architecture of a new world, one in which certain questions cannot be asked, certain investigations cannot be pursued, certain forms of knowledge cannot exist. The economic foundations of the old intellectual order crumble as systematically as its legal protections. Constantine's confiscation of temple treasures provides the financial resources that fund the construction of new churches, but it also destroys the economic basis that had supported pagan scholarship for centuries. Temple complexes had functioned as universities, libraries, hospitals, and research institutions, their activities funded by vast agricultural estates, commercial investments, and religious donations accumulated over generations. When imperial agents seize these endowments, they don't simply transfer wealth from one religious community to another. They eliminate the institutional structures that had made possible the preservation and transmission of non-Christian knowledge. The priest-scholars who attended ancient libraries find themselves without resources to purchase papyrus, maintain buildings, or support students. The copyists who had preserved classical texts discover that there are no longer patrons willing to fund their work. The new Christian institutions that rise on the ruins of pagan temples follow different intellectual priorities. Monastic libraries focus on copying and preserving Christian texts, scripture, theology, hagiography, and selected classical works deemed compatible with Christian doctrine. The vast medical knowledge of pagan antiquity, with its sophisticated understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical technique, survives only when it can be separated from the religious and magical contexts that originally gave it meaning. In monasteries across the empire, scribes labor to create new editions of Galen's medical texts that remove references to pagan gods, eliminate astrological prescriptions, and substitute Christian prayers for traditional healing incantations. The result preserves the technical knowledge while destroying the worldview that had made such knowledge possible. The same process transforms mathematical and astronomical texts. Ptolemy's astronomical observations survive, but his astrological interpretations disappear. Euclidean geometry continues to be taught, but the sacred geometry that connected mathematical relationships to divine harmonies vanishes. The practical knowledge that enables navigation, architecture, and engineering persists, but the theoretical frameworks that had linked these practical skills to comprehensive understandings of cosmic order are systematically eliminated. In the Christian schools that replace pagan institutions of higher learning, students learn to read Latin and Greek so they can study theology, not so they can access the full range of classical literature. They study logic so they can defend Christian doctrine against heretical arguments, not so they can pursue philosophical inquiry wherever it might lead. They learn rhetoric so they can preach effectively, not so they can participate in the open-ended intellectual debates that had characterized pagan education. The transformation of education represents perhaps the most profound victory of the new order. Within a few generations, it becomes literally unthinkable for educated people to approach knowledge in the ways that had seemed natural to their pagan predecessors. The idea that human reason might discover truths not revealed in scripture, that careful observation of natural phenomena might yield insights into divine intentions, that spiritual practices other than Christian prayer might provide access to transcendent reality. All of these possibilities disappear, not because they are forbidden, but because the intellectual foundations that had made them conceivable no longer exist. In the underground chambers beneath Rome, where early Christians had once hidden from imperial persecution, new gatherings take place as the 4th century draws to its close. But these are not meetings of the oppressed seeking comfort in shared faith. They are councils of the triumphant planning the final phases of their victory over the ancient world. Christian leaders who remember when their faith was practiced in secret now design strategies for ensuring that pagan wisdom can never again threaten the souls they have been appointed to guard. They speak of books that must be hunted down in the remotest corners of the empire, of teachers who must be silenced before they can corrupt another generation of students, of traditions that must be eradicated so completely that future generations will never even know they once existed. Their prayers rise through stone chambers that echo with the voices of martyrs, but their petitions no longer ask for protection from persecution. Instead, they thank their God for granting them the power to persecute others, to burn the books that led souls astray, to silence the voices that spoke for false gods, to purify a world that had been corrupted by demonic wisdom. Above ground, in the great libraries that still stand in Alexandria, Athens, and Constantinople, the last pagan scholars continue their work with the desperate intensity of those who know their time is ending. They copy texts with trembling hands, teach students who may not live to pass on what they learn, preserve wisdom that they understand may die with them. The oil lamps flicker in the growing wind that sweeps across the ancient world, carrying with it the smoke of burning books, the dust of demolished temples, and the silence that follows when the last voices of an entire civilization are finally stilled forever. The morning light strikes the marble columns of Alexandria's lecture hall with the golden intensity that has blessed this city since Alexander's architects first traced its streets beside the Mediterranean. In the geometric patterns that dance across the floor as shadows shift with the sun's movement, a woman traces celestial mathematics with her finger, showing her students how the same divine proportions that govern planetary orbits also determine the harmonies of music, the architecture of temples, and the hidden structure of reality itself. Hypatia of Alexandria stands at the intersection of worlds, the last great teacher of the ancient wisdom traditions, the final voice speaking for a cosmos where mathematics and magic intertwine like lovers in an eternal dance. Her hands move with the precision of a surgeon and the grace of a priestess as she demonstrates how Apollonius's conic sections reveal the secret geometry underlying planetary motion, how Diophantus's algebraic innovations unlock numerical relationships that mirror the structure of divine thought. But outside her lecture hall, in the narrow streets where Christian mobs gather with increasing frequency, other voices speak of different revelations. They whisper that this woman who teaches men, who studies the movements of planets, who claims to understand the mind of God through mathematical reasoning, represents everything that must be purified from their holy city. The year is 415, and the ancient world dies with the sound of flesh tearing under oyster shells. In the decades since Theodosius declared Christianity the empire's sole religion, Alexandria has become a battleground where two incompatible visions of reality wage war in libraries, lecture halls, and temple ruins. The city that once welcomed scholars from every corner of the known world now divides along lines that cut deeper than politics or economics, between those who see divinity operating through natural law and those who demand submission to revealed truth, between those who find God in geometric beauty and those who recognize only the authority of Scripture. Hypatia embodies everything the new order cannot tolerate. Daughter of Theon, the last recorded member of Alexandria's museum, she inherits not just her father's mathematical genius, but his role as guardian of intellectual traditions that stretch back to the library's founding. Her commentaries on Apollonius's Conics and Diophantus's Arithmetica represent the final flowering of Greek mathematical thought, works of such sophistication that they will not be equaled for centuries after her death. But her crime extends beyond scholarly achievement. In a world where Christian leaders increasingly insist that women must remain silent in matters of religion and learning, Hypatia teaches publicly, attracts students from across the Mediterranean, and commands intellectual authority that rivals any male philosopher of her age. Her very existence challenges the theological foundations of the new order, suggesting that wisdom can flourish outside the boundaries that Christian doctrine seeks to establish. The Christian patriarch Cyril watches from his episcopal palace as crowds gather to hear this woman explain how mathematical principles reveal divine truth. His prayers have the intensity of military planning as he asks his God to deliver Alexandria from the influence of this pagan sorceress who leads souls astray with the beauty of geometric forms and the seductive elegance of algebraic equations. Cyril understands what many of his contemporaries miss, that Hypatia represents more than individual heresy. She embodies an entire way of knowing that threatens Christianity's claim to exclusive revelation. When she demonstrates that human reason can discover cosmic principles, she implicitly challenges the doctrine that divine truth comes only through scriptural revelation. When she shows students how mathematical beauty reflects divine perfection, she suggests that God's nature can be apprehended through intellectual investigation rather than faith alone. The Patriarch's campaign against Hypatia begins with sermons that grow progressively more inflammatory as winter turns to spring in 415, from his cathedral's marble pulpit, where mosaics depicting Christ's triumph over pagan philosophy provide visual reinforcement for his words. Cyril preaches that the woman who dares to teach men mathematics has aligned herself with demonic powers that seek to corrupt human souls through the false promise of knowledge. His followers listen with the intensity of soldiers receiving battle orders. These are not the educated elite who attend Hypatia's lectures, but working people whose lives have been transformed by Christian promises of eternal salvation, who see in their bishop's words a divine commission to purify their city of influences that threaten their newfound faith. The mob that forms in Alexandria's streets during the Lenten season of 415 moves with the terrible purposefulness of those who believe they serve God's will. Led by a reader named Peter, these Christian zealots hunt through the city's intellectual quarter with the systematic thoroughness of soldiers searching occupied territory for resistance fighters. They find Hypatia returning from her morning lectures, her mind still focused on the mathematical proofs she has been explaining to students who hang on every word as if her voice carries divine revelation. The manuscript case in her hands contains her latest commentary on Diophantus, mathematical insights that push the boundaries of algebraic technique centuries beyond their time. The shells they use to flay the flesh from her bones come from the Mediterranean beaches, where philosophers once walked while debating the nature of reality, where students gathered to hear teachers explain how rational inquiry could reveal divine truth. The same waters that brought ships laden with wisdom from every corner of the ancient world now provide the instruments for destroying the last great representative of that intellectual tradition. They drag her to the Caesareum, the temple that Caesar built to honor Roman power, but that Christians have converted into a church dedicated to their victorious God. In this sacred space where pagan and Christian authorities now overlap, where the old order's monuments serve the new regime's purposes, they complete their purification of Alexandria's intellectual life with ritual violence that echoes sacrificial practices their faith officially condemns. Her death sends shockwaves through what remains of the classical world's intellectual community. In Athens, where the academy still struggles to maintain Platonic traditions under increasing Christian pressure, philosophers realize that the protection of civil law no longer extends to those who teach pre-Christian wisdom. In Constantinople, where a few pagan scholars still hold positions in the imperial university, whispered conversations begin about the necessity of fleeing to Persia or other lands where different gods still protect those who seek truth through reason rather than revelation. But the destruction of Hypatia accomplishes more than silencing one brilliant teacher. Her murder demonstrates that the Christian transformation of the Roman world will tolerate no intellectual alternatives, no competing claims to wisdom, no voices that suggest divine truth might be accessible through any path other than scriptural revelation and ecclesiastical authority. The manuscripts she had been preparing for publication disappear in the chaos that follows her death. Her mathematical insights, which might have accelerated the development of algebraic techniques by centuries, vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The students who had traveled from distant cities to study with her scatter to their home countries, carrying with them not the wisdom they came to acquire, but the terrifying knowledge that intellectual excellence provides no protection against religious fanaticism. In the decades that follow Hypatia's murder, Alexandria's remaining intellectual institutions collapse with the inevitability of buildings whose foundations have been systematically undermined. The museum, which had maintained some vestige of its ancient function through the 4th century, finally closes its doors as the last scholars either convert to Christianity, flee the city, or simply abandon their work in the face of mounting hostility. The Great Library's daughter collection, housed in the Serapeum since the main building's destruction, faces its final crisis as Christian authorities decide that even classical texts stripped of explicitly pagan content pose too great a threat to the faithful. The scrolls that have survived every previous catastrophe, wars, fires, political upheavals, and religious transformations, finally succumb to systematic destruction carried out by those who see in their very existence an affront to divine truth. The last Olympic Games had been celebrated in 393, ending a tradition that stretched back nearly 12 centuries to the earliest Greek attempts to honor their gods through athletic competition. The sacred flame that had burned at Olympia since time immemorial was extinguished by Christian monks who proclaimed that no fire should burn except in honor of the one true God. The oracle at Delphi falls silent as Theodosius's agents close the sanctuary that had provided divine guidance to Greeks for over 1,000 years. The sacred spring that had inspired the Pythia's prophecies continues to flow, but no priestess drinks from waters that are now considered contaminated by demonic influence. The temple complex where Apollo had spoken through human intermediaries becomes a Christian monastery, where monks pray for the purification of a landscape they consider polluted by centuries of pagan worship. At Dodona, Zeus's ancient oracle succumbs to the axes of Christian destroyers who cut down the sacred oak trees whose rustling leaves had carried divine messages since the earliest Greek settlements in Epirus. The bronze tripods that had amplified the gods' whispered words are melted down to create church ornaments that will honor the new deity who tolerates no rivals. Each closed temple, each silenced oracle, each extinguished sacred flame represents more than the end of individual religious practices. Together, they mark the systematic elimination of an entire way of understanding divine communication, one that had assumed gods spoke through natural phenomena, that divinity could be accessed through careful attention to signs and symbols, that human beings could maintain ongoing dialogue with transcendent powers through ritual practices, refined over centuries of experimentation. The philosophical schools that had maintained Greek intellectual traditions for 8 centuries face their final crisis as Christian emperors decide that even non-religious philosophical inquiry poses too great a threat to doctrinal orthodoxy. In 529, Justinian issues the edict that closes the academy in Athens, the institution that Plato had founded 9 centuries earlier as a center for mathematical and philosophical research. Damasius, the last head of the academy, leads the final group of Neoplatonist philosophers into exile in Persia, where Sassanid rulers still welcome intellectuals fleeing Christian persecution. These men carry with them not just their personal knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Commentaries on Plato and Aristotle, mathematical techniques developed by generations of scholars, metaphysical insights refined through centuries of philosophical debate. Their departure marks more than the end of a particular school or intellectual tradition. It represents the completion of a cultural transformation that has eliminated from the Roman world every significant alternative to Christian approaches to knowledge and truth. The empire that had once prided itself on incorporating the best insights from every culture it encountered now defines intellectual excellence as conformity to a single religious tradition's understanding of reality. In Persian courts, where Zoroastrian magi still practice ancient forms of astronomical observation and mathematical calculation, these refugee philosophers discover civilizations that maintain intellectual approaches the Roman world has abandoned. They work with scholars who still see no contradiction between rational inquiry and religious devotion, who continue to develop mathematical techniques for purposes that combine practical utility with spiritual significance. But their exile also highlights the irreversible nature of the transformation that has occurred in their homeland. The intellectual traditions they represent cannot simply be preserved in foreign courts like artifacts in a museum. These approaches to knowledge require entire cultural systems to support them: institutional structures, economic foundations, social recognition, and popular understanding that such inquiries serve valuable purposes. The Roman world that emerges from the Christian transformation possesses none of these supporting elements. Education focuses on theological formation rather than philosophical inquiry. Economic resources flow toward religious institutions rather than secular centers of learning. Social recognition goes to those who demonstrate doctrinal orthodoxy rather than intellectual innovation. Popular culture celebrates faith over reason, revelation over investigation, submission over questioning. In the ruins of the Serapeum, where Christian monks now pray among the broken statues of pagan gods, visitors can still see fragments of the astronomical instruments that priest scholars once used to track planetary motions with mathematical precision. The bronze astrolabe lies shattered among marble fragments that once formed part of a statue depicting Serapis as cosmic ruler. The water clock that had marked the hours for scholarly work fills with rainwater that reflects nothing but empty sky. These ruins tell a story that extends far beyond the destruction of individual buildings or even entire religious traditions. They mark the end of a way of being human that had assumed the cosmos operates according to discoverable principles, that careful observation and rational analysis can reveal divine intentions, that human beings possess both the capacity and the responsibility to understand their place in a universe governed by mathematical harmony and natural law. The silence that settles over Alexandria's intellectual quarter after Hypatia's death carries a quality different from the ordinary quiet that follows any tragedy. This is the silence that comes when entire ways of thinking disappear, when questions that had been explored for centuries become literally unthinkable, when the very possibility of approaching divine truth through human reason vanishes as completely as if it had never existed. In that silence, something irreplaceable dies, not just individual lives or particular books, but humanity's confidence in its own capacity to discover truth through the patient application of reason to the mysteries of existence. The world that emerges from this transformation will be capable of remarkable achievements in theology, art, and spiritual formation. But it will also be a world that has forgotten how to ask certain questions, how to pursue certain forms of investigation, how to trust in the revelatory power of mathematical beauty and rational inquiry. The blood that flows from Hypatia's wounds seeps into Alexandrian soil that has been nourished by centuries of intellectual achievement, that has supported the growth of ideas that pushed the boundaries of human understanding further than they would be pushed again for more than 1,000 years. As that blood darkens in the Mediterranean sun, it carries with it the last traces of a civilization that had dared to believe that human minds could comprehend divine mysteries through the elegant application of reason to the patterns woven into the fabric of reality itself. The midwife's hands shake as she hides the grimoire beneath the hearthstones, each movement precise despite her terror. In the pre-dawn darkness of her cottage, where dried herbs hang from rafters like executed criminals, she can hear the approaching hoofbeats of the Inquisition's horses. The book she conceals contains knowledge that has flowed through women's hands for centuries. Lunar calendars that time births and deaths, plant wisdom that eases labor and prevents conception, dream interpretations that guide souls through the mysteries of sleep and vision. Tonight, this knowledge becomes heresy punishable by fire. The manuscript her grandmother pressed into her hands on her deathbed holds secrets that Christianity cannot tolerate. Not because they are false, but because they are true in ways that threaten the Church's monopoly on miraculous power. When her poultices heal wounds that priests' prayers cannot touch, when her tonics ease suffering that holy relics fail to relieve, when her predictions prove more accurate than episcopal prophecies, she demonstrates that divine power flows through channels the Church has not sanctified. For this, she must burn. In the centuries following Hypatia's murder, the systematic destruction of pagan wisdom enters a new phase, one that targets not just the grand libraries and philosophical schools, but the intimate knowledge that flows through family lines, market stalls, and cottage workshops. The texts that Christian authorities now hunt exist in manuscript copies, hidden beneath floorboards, sewn into clothing, buried in gardens where moonlight reveals their location to those who know the proper signs to read. Pope Gregory VII, writing from his papal throne in 1080, issues bulls that read like military orders dispatched to an army of intellectual occupation. His words carry the authority of divine command as he mandates the destruction of all books containing curious arts, a category that encompasses everything from astronomical calculations to herbal remedies, from dream interpretation to mathematical techniques that serve non-Christian purposes. The papal definition of prohibited knowledge expands with each successive decree. What begins as condemnation of explicit spellcasting broadens to include any systematic study of natural phenomena that assumes divine power operates through discoverable principles, rather than arbitrary miracle. Astronomy becomes suspect when it ventures beyond practical navigation into astrological interpretation. Medicine becomes dangerous when it relies on natural substances rather than prayer and relic worship. Mathematics becomes heretical when it explores sacred geometry or numerical relationships that suggest divine order might be comprehensible to human reason. The Malleus Maleficarum, that handbook of witch hunting published in 1487, systematizes the persecution of women's knowledge with the bureaucratic efficiency of a tax collection manual. Its authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, understand that the traditions they seek to destroy have preserved forms of practical wisdom that compete directly with ecclesiastical authority. When women demonstrate that careful observation of natural cycles can predict weather patterns more accurately than priestly divination, when their herbal preparations prove more effective than blessed oils and holy water, when their understanding of human psychology enables them to counsel the troubled with greater success than confession and penance, they reveal the inadequacy of purely religious approaches to life's practical challenges. The Malleus authors recognize that women's bodies themselves constitute repositories of forbidden knowledge. The cyclical nature of menstruation connects women to lunar rhythms that pre-Christian traditions had considered sacred manifestations of cosmic order. The intimate knowledge of pregnancy and childbirth provides access to mysteries of life and death that rival the Church's claims about resurrection and eternal life. The practical wisdom of herb gathering, food preparation, and household management preserves techniques for manipulating material reality that operate independently of Christian sacramental systems. Their solution requires the systematic elimination of every woman who demonstrates mastery of such knowledge. The wise women who serve as healers, counselors, and spiritual guides in their communities must be redefined as witches who derive their power from demonic sources. The midwives who ease labor and prevent maternal death must be portrayed as servants of Satan who traffic in forbidden arts. The herb women who maintain botanical knowledge must be characterized as poisoners who threaten Christian society. In German villages, where the printing press has begun to spread literacy beyond ecclesiastical control, inquisitors conduct manuscript hunts with the thoroughness of military campaigns. They know that the magical texts they seek exist in multiple copies, passed down through generations of practitioners who have preserved pre-Christian wisdom traditions despite centuries of persecution. Each discovered grimoire leads to interrogations that reveal networks of hidden knowledge keepers. Each confession extracted through torture exposes additional targets for investigation. The books they burn contain practical wisdom that will not be rediscovered for centuries. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic preserves Greek and Arabic techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness through controlled breathing, dietary modification, and sensory manipulation. The Picatrix, translated from Arabic into Latin by scholars who understood its value despite its dangerous content, contains sophisticated instructions for timing ritual activities according to planetary movements, creating talismans that focus psychological energy for therapeutic purposes, and developing forms of meditation that integrate intellectual and emotional development. These texts represent synthetic knowledge traditions that had evolved through centuries of experimentation and refinement. Their authors were not primitive superstitionists, but sophisticated researchers who had discovered effective techniques for influencing psychological states, enhancing mental performance, and achieving forms of consciousness that expanded human potential in directions the Church considered threatening. When inquisitorial fires consume these manuscripts, they destroy not just books, but entire sciences of human development that had required centuries to perfect. The techniques for inducing prophetic dreams, the methods for enhancing memory and concentration, the procedures for achieving mystical experiences that transcended ordinary consciousness. All of this vanishes in smoke that carries with it humanity's accumulated understanding of psychological and spiritual techniques that operated outside Christian frameworks. In the Islamic world, where Christian persecution has driven many scholars to seek refuge in courts that still welcome intellectual inquiry, Arabic translations of Greek magical texts survive in libraries that European inquisitors cannot reach. The scholars of Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo preserve copies of Hermetic treatises, Neoplatonic theurgy manuals, and alchemical works that document systematic approaches to spiritual development through the manipulation of material substances. These Arabic grimoires maintain traditions that European Christianity has systematically eliminated. Their pages contain instructions for creating elixirs that enhance cognitive function, techniques for achieving direct mystical experience through controlled modification of consciousness, and methods for developing psychic abilities that enable practitioners to perceive information unavailable through ordinary sensory channels. But even these refugees face increasing pressure as Christian military campaigns penetrate deeper into Islamic territories. The Reconquista in Spain, the Crusades in the Middle East, and diplomatic pressure on Islamic rulers throughout the Mediterranean region all serve to reduce the spaces where non-Christian approaches to knowledge can survive and develop. The scholars who tend these Arabic libraries understand that they preserve not just individual texts, but entire ways of approaching reality that have been systematically eliminated from Christian Europe. Their translations maintain scientific traditions that combine empirical observation with spiritual practice, that see no contradiction between rational investigation and mystical experience, that assume human beings possess both the capacity and the responsibility to develop their full potential through systematic training. When Christian armies capture these Islamic libraries, they discover treasures that surpass the value of gold and jewels. The books they find contain mathematical techniques that European scholars have forgotten, astronomical observations that surpass contemporary Christian knowledge, medical treatments that demonstrate effectiveness unknown to European physicians, and philosophical insights that reveal the poverty of purely theological approaches to understanding reality. Their response follows patterns established during earlier phases of the campaign against pagan knowledge. The most obviously magical texts burn immediately in bonfires that light up the courtyards of conquered cities. Works that contain useful practical information undergo careful editing to remove any content that suggests divine power operates through natural law rather than arbitrary miracle. Philosophical treatises that explore non-Christian approaches to spiritual development disappear entirely, their insights lost as completely as if they had never been committed to writing. In the scriptoriums of Christian monasteries, monks labor to create purified versions of classical texts that preserve technical knowledge while eliminating the worldviews that had made such knowledge possible. Their work requires extraordinary intellectual sophistication. They must understand texts well enough to identify dangerous content while preserving information that serves Christian purposes. A medical treatise that describes surgical procedures must be edited to remove references to astrological timing, herbal preparations that invoke pagan deities, and diagnostic techniques that assume illness results from spiritual imbalances rather than divine punishment for sin. Mathematical works that explore geometric relationships must be stripped of content that suggests sacred proportions reflect divine intentions that human reason can comprehend. Astronomical texts that document celestial observations must eliminate interpretations that attribute influence to planetary movements. The result preserves fragments of ancient wisdom while destroying the intellectual frameworks that had given such wisdom meaning and effectiveness. European medicine retains surgical techniques but loses the holistic understanding that had connected physical healing to psychological and spiritual development. Mathematics continues to be taught, but only as a tool for practical calculation rather than as a pathway to divine understanding. Astronomy survives, but only as a means for determining calendar dates and navigation routes rather than as a science of cosmic meaning. In the village workshops, where craft guilds maintain technical traditions passed down through generations of master artisans, guild leaders face impossible choices as Christian authorities expand their definition of forbidden knowledge. The stonemasons who build cathedrals use geometric techniques that derive from ancient temple construction, but they must conceal the sacred symbolism that had originally guided such work. The metalworkers who create church ornaments employ alchemical knowledge that assumes spiritual principles operate through material transformation, but they must disguise their understanding in purely technical language. The musicians who compose sacred polyphony draw upon mathematical relationships that connect musical harmony to cosmic order, but they must present their work as inspired revelation rather than discovered natural law. These craftsmen understand that their technical mastery depends upon knowledge that Christian doctrine cannot acknowledge. When they create works of transcendent beauty, they do so by applying principles that assume matter itself possesses spiritual properties, that human creativity participates in divine creation, that careful attention to natural proportions can produce effects that transcend purely material causation. Their survival requires them to develop double languages that express dangerous truths in forms that appear orthodox to ecclesiastical authorities. Guild initiation ceremonies that once explicitly connected craft mastery to spiritual development now disguise such teachings in symbolic actions that preserve ancient wisdom while avoiding direct confrontation with Christian doctrine. But this strategy of concealment cannot protect knowledge that requires open transmission to survive and develop. The most sophisticated techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness, the most effective methods for developing psychic abilities, the most powerful procedures for influencing material reality through focused intention. All of these approaches to human development require teacher-student relationships that involve explicit instruction in theoretical frameworks as well as practical techniques. When such teaching becomes impossible, entire sciences of human potential atrophy and disappear. The knowledge survives only in fragmentary form, preserved in symbolic systems that become increasingly incomprehensible as the traditions that had maintained their meaning vanish from living memory. In the forests of northern Europe, where Celtic and Germanic traditions have maintained oral preservation of pre-Christian wisdom despite centuries of persecution, the final phase of the Grimoire Purge targets the human repositories that had proven more durable than written texts. The wise women who serve as healers and spiritual guides in isolated communities face systematic hunting by inquisitorial agents who understand that such women represent the last links to comprehensive magical traditions. These women carry in their memories knowledge that encompasses far more than the individual techniques described in written grimoires. They understand how different practices fit together into coherent systems of spiritual development, how various herbs and minerals can be combined for effects that transcend the properties of individual substances, how psychological and spiritual preparation enables practitioners to achieve results that appear miraculous to those who lack proper training. When the Inquisition burns these women, it destroys not just individual practitioners, but entire schools of knowledge that had maintained sophisticated understanding of human potential across centuries of cultural transformation. Their deaths eliminate the last possibility that comprehensive magical traditions might survive into the modern era as living systems of practice rather than historical curiosities. The smoke that rises from countless village pyres carries with it the essence of humanity's most profound investigations into the nature of consciousness, the structure of reality, and the techniques for developing human potential beyond the limitations that Christianity had declared permanent and divinely ordained. In the ashes of burned grimoires and the charred bones of executed practitioners, Europe buries not just individual texts and lives, but entire approaches to understanding that had assumed human beings possess capacities for development that extend far beyond anything Christian doctrine could accommodate. The world that emerges from this systematic destruction will be capable of remarkable achievements in technology, science, and social organization. But it will also be a world that has forgotten how to access forms of knowledge that require the integration of intellectual understanding with direct spiritual experience that demand the cultivation of consciousness, as well as the accumulation of information. The darkness that settles over European intellectual life in the wake of the Grimoire Purge represents more than the temporary victory of one religious tradition over its competitors. It marks the beginning of a long night of forgetfulness, during which humanity will lose touch with dimensions of its own nature that earlier ages had considered essential to complete human development. The last grimoires burn in fires that seem to consume not just parchment and ink, but the very possibility that human beings might discover divine truth through pathways other than those sanctioned by ecclesiastical authority. The flames die down to embers that glow briefly in the darkness before cooling to ash that the wind scatters across landscapes that will never again witness the systematic cultivation of human potential that had once been considered humanity's highest calling. The monk's quill scratches across parchment in the scriptorium of Chartres Cathedral, where morning light filters through stained glass windows that transform the written page into a kaleidoscope of sacred colour. Brother William copies Plato's Timaeus with the devotion of a man transcribing scripture. Yet he knows he performs an act of subtle rebellion. Each word he preserves carries within it seeds of understanding that could shatter the theological certainties his superiors have built upon the ruins of the ancient world. But Brother William understands what his ecclesiastical masters do not, that some truths are too beautiful to die, too necessary to abandon, too powerful to remain buried beneath the ashes of burned libraries. The wisdom he copies will survive not through open defiance, but through patient camouflage, not through dramatic resistance, but through the quiet persistence of those who recognize sacred knowledge wherever they encounter it. In the margins of his manuscript, where official eyes rarely venture, he adds notations that decode Plato's cosmology in language that sounds sufficiently Christian to escape censure, while preserving insights that stretch back to the Egyptian mysteries and Pythagorean mathematical mysticism. Even the flames that consumed the great libraries could not devour everything. Knowledge flows like water, finding cracks in the stone walls that human authority builds to contain it, seeping through foundations that seem solid, emerging in unexpected places, where those who thirst for wisdom can drink from springs that connect them to sources their oppressors believe they have sealed forever. The school of Chartres becomes one such hidden spring during the 12th century, where scholars who call themselves Christians develop interpretations of Platonic philosophy that preserve ancient cosmological insights while disguising them in theological language that satisfies ecclesiastical authorities. Here, in Gothic halls where sunlight streams through windows that transform stone into symphony, teachers speak of divine emanation in terms that echo Plotinus, explore mathematical relationships that mirror Pythagorean sacred geometry, and investigate natural philosophy using methods that derive from Hermetic traditions. Gilbert of Poitiers lectures on the divine nature using conceptual frameworks that Damasius would recognize, though he presents them as orthodox Christian doctrine. Bernard Silvestris writes cosmological poetry that describes the creation of the world in language that preserves Neoplatonic metaphysics, while appearing to celebrate biblical revelation. Thierry of Chartres develops mathematical approaches to theology that maintain Platonic assumptions about the relationship between geometric forms and divine reality. These Christian Platonists understand that they walk a razor's edge between preservation and destruction. Their work requires extraordinary intellectual sophistication. They must master ancient philosophical traditions well enough to preserve their essential insights while translating them into vocabularies that will not trigger inquisitorial investigation. When they speak of divine ideas existing in God's mind, they preserve Plato's theory of forms. When they describe mathematical relationships underlying natural phenomena, they maintain Pythagorean sacred geometry. When they explore the soul's ascent through hierarchies of being, they transmit Neoplatonic mysticism. Their success depends upon the ignorance of their ecclesiastical supervisors, who lack sufficient philosophical education to recognize that apparently orthodox Christian doctrines conceal worldviews that undermine the theological foundations of medieval Christianity. The bishops who approve these scholars' writings do not understand that Platonic emanation theory makes biblical creation doctrine logically unnecessary, that Pythagorean mathematical mysticism suggests divine truth can be discovered through human reason rather than scriptural revelation, that Neoplatonic psychology assumes human souls possess capacities that transcend anything Christian anthropology can accommodate. In the monasteries of Ireland, where Celtic Christianity maintains practices that blend Christian devotion with pre-Christian wisdom traditions, monks preserve knowledge that mainland European authorities would consider dangerously heretical. The illuminated manuscripts they create in scriptoriums overlooking Atlantic waters where pagan gods once walked combine biblical imagery with symbolic systems that derive from Druidic tree lore, astronomical observation techniques that merge Christian calendar calculations with Celtic seasonal mysticism, and artistic motifs that encode mathematical relationships explored by ancient Irish scholars. The Book of Kells displays geometric patterns that function as more than mere decoration. They constitute visual mathematics that preserves ancient Celtic understanding of sacred proportion and cosmic harmony. The spiral forms that flow across its pages follow mathematical principles that Irish monastics learned from Druidic traditions, but disguise as Christian meditation aids. The intricate knotwork that borders its text encodes numerical relationships that Celtic scholars had developed for calculating astronomical cycles, but present as symbolic representations of eternal divine perfection. These Irish monks understand that their preservation work requires careful balance between innovation and tradition. They cannot simply copy pagan texts without modification, but they also cannot allow ancient wisdom to disappear entirely. Their solution involves creating new forms of Christian art and literature that maintain pre-Christian insights while expressing them through imagery and language that will not provoke ecclesiastical persecution. In the remote monasteries of Ethiopia, where Coptic Christianity develops in relative isolation from European theological controversies. Monks preserve magical texts that mainland Christianity has condemned as demonic. Their libraries contain Solomonic grimoires that describe techniques for communicating with spiritual beings, Enochian texts that map celestial hierarchies unknown to Orthodox angelology, and Hermetic treatises that explore the relationship between divine consciousness and material reality. Ethiopian magic scrolls combine Christian prayers with invocations that derive from ancient African spiritual traditions, creating synthetic practices that maintain pre-Christian techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness while presenting them as legitimate forms of Christian devotion. The practitioners who use these scrolls understand that they preserve ancient wisdom traditions by embedding them within religious frameworks that protect them from the systematic persecution that has eliminated similar practices elsewhere in the Christian world. The theology that supports these Ethiopian practices assumes that divine power operates through discoverable spiritual laws rather than arbitrary miracle, that human beings can learn techniques for accessing supernatural assistance through proper training and preparation, that the material world responds to spiritual influence exercised by those who understand the hidden connections between consciousness and physical reality. These assumptions directly contradict the theological foundations of European Christianity, which insists that miraculous power flows exclusively through ecclesiastical channels, and that any attempt to access supernatural assistance through non-Christian methods constitutes trafficking with demonic forces. But Ethiopian Christianity's isolation protects its practitioners from pressures that would force them to choose between preserving ancient wisdom and maintaining religious orthodoxy. In the courts of Islamic Spain, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars collaborate in translation projects that preserve classical texts, ancient wisdom survives through scholarly networks that transcend religious boundaries. The translators who work in Cordoba, Toledo, and Seville understand that they participate in humanity's attempt to recover intellectual treasures that European Christianity has abandoned, but that other traditions recognize as invaluable components of human knowledge. Arabic translations of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos preserve astrological knowledge that Christian authorities have condemned as devil worship. Hebrew versions of Hermetic treatises maintain alchemical traditions that European inquisitors have systematically destroyed. Latin adaptations of Islamic philosophical works transmit Aristotelian and Neoplatonic insights that Chartres scholars will use to construct apparently Christian philosophies that actually undermine medieval theology's intellectual foundations. These translation projects require delicate negotiations between scholars who represent incompatible religious traditions, but who share recognition that ancient wisdom transcends sectarian boundaries. Muslim philosophers who preserve Greek mathematical mysticism, Jewish Kabbalists who develop systems that echo Egyptian magical techniques, and Christian Platonists who disguise Hermetic insights as orthodox theology all contribute to preservation networks that maintain intellectual diversity despite increasing pressure toward religious uniformity. The Corpus Hermeticum surfaces in Constantinople during the Byzantine Empire's final decades, preserved in manuscripts that Greek scholars carry with them as Ottoman armies advance toward the capital. When Cosimo de' Medici's agents acquire these texts in 1460, they unknowingly purchase documents that contain the most complete collection of Hermetic wisdom to survive the centuries of Christian persecution. Marsilio Ficino's translation of these Hermetic treatises into Latin triggers an intellectual revolution that transforms European understanding of ancient wisdom. Scholars who read his versions discover sophisticated psychological techniques for developing human consciousness, mathematical approaches to understanding cosmic structure, and philosophical frameworks that integrate rational investigation with mystical experience. But Ficino's success depends upon historical ignorance that protects him from the persecution that had destroyed earlier preservers of Hermetic knowledge. Renaissance scholars believe they have discovered ancient Egyptian wisdom that predates Christianity and therefore cannot be considered heretical Christian deviation. They do not understand that the texts they celebrate as pristine pagan philosophy actually represent synthetic traditions that had evolved through centuries of interaction between Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and early Christian mystical schools. This historical misunderstanding provides political protection that enables Renaissance humanists to explore ideas that medieval inquisitors would have recognized as dangerously heretical. When they describe techniques for achieving divine consciousness through intellectual contemplation, when they investigate mathematical relationships that connect human psychology to cosmic structure, when they develop practical methods for influencing material reality through focused intention, they participate in traditions that earlier Christian authorities had systematically eliminated because they understood their theological implications. In the hidden archives of Icelandic families, where literacy rates remain remarkably high despite the island's geographic isolation, saga writers preserve Norse cosmological traditions in literary works that disguise pre-Christian wisdom as historical narrative. The Prose Edda and Poetic Edda contain mythological accounts that encode sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles, psychological development techniques, and shamanic practices that Scandinavian cultures had refined over centuries. These Icelandic texts preserve knowledge through narrative strategies that parallel the techniques used by Shatra philosophers and Ethiopian monks. When they describe Odin's sacrifice on the World Tree, they transmit ancient shamanic methods for achieving visionary experiences. When they map the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, they preserve astronomical knowledge that connects earthly events to celestial cycles. When they recount the exploits of heroes who travel between realms, they maintain practical instructions for achieving altered states of consciousness that enable direct perception of spiritual realities. The Christian conversion of Iceland had been relatively peaceful compared to the violent campaigns that eliminated paganism elsewhere in Europe, and this difference creates cultural conditions that enable more complete preservation of pre-Christian traditions. Icelandic scholars can write about Norse gods and their associated practices because they present them as historical curiosities rather than living religious alternatives to Christianity. But this literary preservation strategy has limitations that become apparent as medieval church authorities develop more sophisticated techniques for identifying and eliminating disguised paganism. By the 13th century, Icelandic scholars must exercise increasing caution in their treatment of pre-Christian themes, and the most explicitly magical content begins to disappear from their writings. In the oral traditions maintained by European folk cultures, where literacy remains limited and ecclesiastical influence encounters resistance from ancient customs, fragments of pre-Christian wisdom survive in forms that educated authorities fail to recognize as preserving sophisticated knowledge systems. Folk songs that seem to describe simple agricultural activities actually encode astronomical information that farmers use for timing, planting, and harvesting. Children's games that appear to be mere entertainment preserve memory techniques that once enabled druidic students to memorize vast quantities of oral literature. Folk tales that sound like primitive superstitions actually contain practical instructions for achieving psychological states that enhance healing, divination, and other forms of consciousness-based intervention in material reality. These folk traditions preserve ancient wisdom through cultural mechanisms that operate below the threshold of ecclesiastical attention. Church authorities who concern themselves with eliminating written texts and suppressing formal magical practices often overlook the knowledge embedded in seemingly innocent cultural activities that common people maintain as part of their traditional way of life. Village-wise women who lead community celebrations of seasonal festivals understand that they preserve ancient Celtic and Germanic religious practices, but they present them as innocent folk customs rather than pagan spiritual observances. Traveling storytellers who recite tales that contain encoded shamanic techniques know that they transmit ancient wisdom, but they disguise their knowledge as popular entertainment rather than spiritual instruction. The effectiveness of these preservation strategies depends upon maintaining a careful balance between cultural continuity and religious conformity. Folk practitioners must preserve enough traditional content to maintain the effectiveness of ancient techniques while avoiding behaviors that will attract unwanted attention from ecclesiastical authorities. But this balance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as church influence penetrates deeper into rural communities and literacy rates increase among common people. The folk traditions that had preserved ancient wisdom for centuries begin to fragment and lose their coherence as the social structures that had supported them encounter pressures from new forms of religious and political authority. In the private libraries of wealthy European families, where collectors acquire manuscripts that include works too dangerous for public circulation, ancient texts survive in the forms that scholars cannot openly study, but that preserve complete versions of knowledge that exists elsewhere only in fragments. These hidden collections include original Greek magical papyri that describe techniques for achieving divine consciousness, complete versions of Hermetic treatises that mainstream scholars know only through heavily edited excerpts, and alchemical texts that maintain practical instructions for developing human potential through systematic spiritual practices. The collectors who maintain these libraries understand that they preserve intellectual treasures that represent humanity's highest achievements in understanding consciousness and reality, but they also know that public acknowledgement of their holdings would result in confiscation and destruction by ecclesiastical authorities. Their preservation efforts require not only financial resources, but also networks of trusted scholars who can study and copy dangerous texts while maintaining absolute secrecy about their activities. These private preservation efforts create conditions that enable certain forms of ancient wisdom to survive even the most systematic persecution. But they also ensure that such knowledge remains available only to small groups of initiated scholars, rather than contributing to general human development. The wisdom that had once been taught openly in temple schools and philosophical academies becomes the closely guarded secret of elite networks that must conceal their very existence to avoid destruction. As the medieval period draws toward its close and Renaissance humanism begins to create new opportunities for exploring ancient wisdom, these various preservation efforts start to converge in ways that will eventually enable partial recovery of intellectual traditions that had seemed permanently lost. The Platonic texts preserved at Chartres, the Hermetic traditions maintained in Islamic translation, the Norse wisdom encoded in Icelandic literature, and the folk knowledge embedded in European cultural practices begin to reconnect through scholarly networks that recognize their common origins in pre-Christian wisdom traditions. But this convergence also reveals the extent of what has been permanently lost. The comprehensive systems of spiritual development that had once enabled systematic cultivation of human consciousness exist now only in fragments that must be painstakingly reconstructed by scholars who lack direct access to the living traditions that had originally given such knowledge meaning and effectiveness. The light that begins to dawn over Renaissance Europe illuminates libraries that contain only shadows of the wisdom that had once blazed in the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. The texts that survive preserve enough ancient knowledge to inspire new investigations into human potential, but they also serve as monuments to the vast intellectual tragedy that had eliminated entire sciences of consciousness from human memory. In monastery cells where oil lamps burn through another night of copying, where Renaissance scholars study fragments of Hermetic wisdom by candlelight, where folk practitioners maintain ancient customs in villages that ecclesiastical authorities rarely visit, the patient work of preservation continues. Those who tend these scattered embers of ancient wisdom understand that they keep alive possibilities for human development that the dominant culture has declared impossible, that they maintain connections to forms of knowledge that official authorities insist do not exist, But they also understand that they preserve this knowledge in forms that bear little resemblance to the comprehensive traditions that had once enabled systematic exploration of consciousness and reality. The wisdom that survives exists as isolated fragments, disconnected techniques, symbolic systems whose meanings must be reconstructed by scholars who lack access to the living teachers, who had once transmitted such knowledge through direct personal instruction. The preservation has succeeded in maintaining enough ancient wisdom to demonstrate that human beings once possessed understanding that transcends anything the Christian world has developed, but it has failed to maintain the institutional structures and cultural frameworks that had made such understanding practically accessible to those who sought complete human development. The archaeologist's brush whispers against pottery shards in the Egyptian sand, each careful stroke revealing hieroglyphs that have not seen daylight since Christian monks sealed the chamber 13 centuries ago. Beneath the Coptic monastery of St. Macarius, where the Desert Fathers once prayed for deliverance from the wisdom of this world, forgotten chambers yield their secrets to scholars who understand they are exhuming more than ancient artifacts. They are recovering fragments of humanity's lost mind. In 1945, at Nag Hammadi, peasants digging for fertilizer unearthed a sealed jar containing codices that Christianity had successfully eliminated from all known libraries. The Gnostic Gospels emerge from their earthen tomb like voices speaking across an abyss of silence, revealing forms of early Christianity that recognized divine spark dwelling within human consciousness, that taught techniques for achieving direct mystical experience, that assumed each soul contains capacities for transcendence that Orthodox doctrine had declared impossible. These discoveries arrive in a world that has forgotten not just what the ancients knew, but what kinds of knowledge human beings once considered essential to complete development. The 20th century, with its unprecedented technological achievements and its systematic scientific investigation of material reality, encounters ancient texts that describe forms of understanding it can barely comprehend, techniques for developing consciousness that its educational institutions do not recognize, and approaches to reality that its philosophical frameworks cannot accommodate. But the earth continues to yield its buried treasures. In monastery libraries where medieval monks had hidden dangerous texts behind walls that modern renovation finally penetrates, in desert caves where hermits had concealed forbidden wisdom before fleeing imperial persecution, in foundation stones of ancient buildings, where builders had embedded protective charms that carry forward pre-Christian knowledge, fragments of the ancient wisdom continue to surface like spring water breaking through winter ice. Each discovery reveals not just individual texts, but evidence of comprehensive systems of human development that had once enabled systematic exploration of consciousness, reality, and human potential. The scattered papyri that archaeologists piece together from monastery, refuse heaps describe meditation techniques that parallel modern discoveries about neuroplasticity and consciousness research. The alchemical manuscripts that emerge from castle walls demonstrate sophisticated understanding of psychological development that anticipates contemporary insights about the relationship between spiritual practice and mental health. But these archaeological recoveries also highlight the magnitude of what has been permanently lost. For every text that emerges from buried caches, scholars recognize evidence of dozens of related works that have vanished without trace. The fragments that survive suggest vast intellectual traditions that had developed sophisticated approaches to questions that modern civilization is only beginning to formulate. The ancient world had possessed sciences of consciousness that enabled systematic development of human capacities that contemporary culture considers either fictional or pathological. The meditation techniques described in surviving Hermetic texts produce effects that neuroscientists are now documenting in laboratory conditions. The healing practices preserved in folk traditions demonstrate therapeutic effectiveness that medical researchers are beginning to investigate. The astronomical observations recorded in rescued manuscripts reveal understanding of cosmic cycles that contemporary astronomy is rediscovering through space-based telescopes and computer modeling. Yet the institutional frameworks that had made such knowledge practically accessible the educational systems that had transmitted such understanding across generations, and the cultural context that had given such wisdom meaning and application. All of this supporting infrastructure disappeared so completely that modern scholars can study ancient techniques without possessing the cultural foundations necessary to understand their significance or apply them effectively. The Christianity that triumphed over the ancient world had accomplished more than theological victory. It had fundamentally transformed human understanding of knowledge itself. The epistemological revolution that accompanied Christian dominance redefined the very categories through which human beings organize their approach to learning, investigation, and development. Where ancient cultures had assumed that human reason could discover divine truths through careful investigation of natural phenomena, Christian doctrine insisted that divine truth comes exclusively through scriptural revelation interpreted by ecclesiastical authority. Where pagan traditions had encouraged empirical investigation of consciousness and reality, Christian theology declared that such investigation represents prideful rebellion against divinely established limitations on human knowledge. Where pre-Christian education had aimed to develop human capacities to their fullest potential, Christian formation focused on producing obedient believers who accepted doctrinal teachings without question. Where ancient wisdom traditions had integrated intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual development into comprehensive systems of human formation, Christian education separated these domains and subordinated all learning to theological purposes. This transformation created cultural conditions that made certain forms of investigation literally unthinkable for educated people. The idea that human consciousness might possess capacities that transcend ordinary sensory perception became not merely false, but conceptually incoherent. The possibility that material reality might respond to consciousness in ways that violate mechanistic assumptions became not just wrong, but logically impossible. The suggestion that human beings might achieve forms of understanding that transcend scriptural revelation became not only heretical, but psychologically incomprehensible. The scientific revolution that began in the Renaissance and reached its mature form during the Enlightenment recovered certain aspects of ancient intellectual methods, particularly the emphasis on empirical observation and mathematical analysis. But it did so within conceptual frameworks that retained crucial limitations inherited from the Christian worldview that had replaced pagan approaches to knowledge. Modern science adopted the ancient commitment to rational investigation of natural phenomena, but it accepted Christian assumptions about the separation between matter and consciousness, between objective and subjective reality, between empirical investigation and spiritual development. The result produced unprecedented understanding of material processes while eliminating from scientific consideration precisely those aspects of reality that ancient wisdom traditions had considered most important. Contemporary physics discovers that consciousness appears to play a fundamental role in quantum mechanical processes, but it lacks conceptual frameworks for understanding how consciousness might be systematically developed to enhance scientific investigation. Modern neuroscience maps the brain with extraordinary precision, but it operates within materialistic assumptions that prevent it from seriously investigating experiences that suggest consciousness transcends neural activity. Current psychology develops sophisticated techniques for treating mental illness, but it cannot accommodate ancient insights about forms of psychological development that enable access to transpersonal dimensions of experience. The fragments of ancient wisdom that survive in contemporary culture exist as isolated curiosities, rather than as components of comprehensive systems that once enabled systematic human development. Meditation techniques derived from Eastern traditions are investigated for their therapeutic benefits, but separated from the cosmological frameworks that had given them meaning. Herbal remedies based on ancient knowledge are studied for their biochemical properties, but divorced from the spiritual practices that had originally guided their application. Astronomical observations recorded by ancient cultures are valued for their historical interest, but disconnected from the astrological interpretations that had made them relevant to human experience. This fragmentation reflects the epistemological damage that resulted from the systematic destruction of ancient wisdom traditions. When comprehensive approaches to human development are eliminated, the scattered techniques that survive lose their context and effectiveness. When spiritual technologies are separated from the cultural frameworks that support their proper application, they become either ineffective curiosities or dangerous practices that can produce psychological harm rather than beneficial development. The contemporary world faces challenges that require forms of understanding that ancient wisdom traditions had developed, but that modern civilization has abandoned. The ecological crisis that threatens planetary survival requires the kind of holistic thinking that pre-Christian cultures had cultivated through their recognition of interconnection between human consciousness and natural processes. The psychological epidemics of depression, anxiety, and meaninglessness that characterize modern life call for approaches to human development that address spiritual as well as material needs. The social fragmentation that produces political polarization and cultural conflict demands wisdom about community formation that ancient traditions had refined through centuries of practical application. But modern culture lacks access to the comprehensive systems of knowledge that might address these challenges because the intellectual traditions that had developed such systems were systematically eliminated during the Christian transformation of the ancient world. Contemporary civilization possesses unprecedented technological capabilities and scientific knowledge, but it has inherited profound gaps in understanding that result from the cultural catastrophe that destroyed entire approaches to human development. The ancient world had understood that complete human education requires not just information transfer, but consciousness transformation. Not just intellectual development, but spiritual formation. Not just individual achievement, but community wisdom. The educational systems that Christianity replaced had assumed that human beings possess capacities for development that extend far beyond anything contemporary culture recognizes as possible or desirable. These ancient approaches to human formation had produced individuals who could function effectively in material reality while maintaining access to transpersonal dimensions of experience, who could analyze practical problems with rational precision, while drawing upon intuitive insights that transcended logical analysis, who could participate in community life while pursuing individual development that served collective as well as personal purposes. The destruction of these educational traditions eliminated not just particular techniques or specific knowledge, but entire models of human possibility that had once seemed natural and achievable. Contemporary culture cannot conceive of producing individuals who possess the capacities that ancient wisdom traditions had systematically developed because it lacks the conceptual frameworks and institutional structures that had made such development possible. Modern efforts to recover ancient wisdom face obstacles that result directly from the epistemological transformation that accompanied the Christian destruction of pagan knowledge. Contemporary scholars who study ancient texts cannot understand them properly because they lack access to the living traditions that had given such texts meaning and practical application. Modern practitioners who attempt to apply ancient techniques cannot achieve the results that traditional cultures had considered normal because they operate within cultural contexts that do not support such practices. The fragmented preservation of ancient wisdom during the medieval period, while heroic in its intention and partially successful in its results, could not maintain the comprehensive understanding that had made such wisdom effective. The techniques that survived exist as historical artifacts rather than as living components of functional systems for human development. Yet the archaeological discoveries that continue to emerge from buried libraries, hidden chambers, and desert caves suggest that humanity once possessed understanding that transcends anything contemporary civilization has achieved. The mathematical sophistication of ancient astronomical observations surpasses modern calculations in certain areas. The psychological insights preserved in Hermetic texts anticipate contemporary discoveries about consciousness and mental development. The ecological wisdom embedded in pre-Christian traditions offers approaches to environmental challenges that technological solutions alone cannot address. These discoveries raise profound questions about the nature of progress and the direction of human development. If ancient cultures had developed understanding that contemporary civilization lacks, if traditional wisdom traditions had achieved insights that modern science is only beginning to rediscover, if pre-Christian approaches to human formation had produced capacities that current educational systems cannot even conceptualize, then what does it mean to claim that humanity has advanced beyond its primitive past? The ashes of burned libraries contain more than destroyed books. They hold the residue of human possibilities that were systematically eliminated when one approach to reality achieved total dominance over all alternatives. The silence that followed the last voices of ancient wisdom represents more than the end of particular traditions. It marks the beginning of a cultural amnesia that continues to impoverish human understanding, centuries after the flames died down. In the meditation halls of contemporary spiritual centers, where ancient techniques are taught to modern practitioners seeking relief from the psychological pressures of technological civilization, fragments of the old wisdom continue to demonstrate their effectiveness. Students who learn traditional meditation practices discover that systematic consciousness development produces benefits that extend far beyond stress reduction or emotional regulation. Practitioners who study preserved texts from ancient mystery schools encounter approaches to spiritual formation that enable direct experience of transpersonal dimensions of reality. But these contemporary explorations occur within cultural contexts that cannot fully support or integrate the insights that such practices generate. Modern practitioners who achieve states of consciousness that ancient traditions considered normal stages of human development often find themselves isolated within cultural systems that have no categories for understanding or utilizing such experiences. The medical professionals who investigate traditional healing practices discover that many ancient techniques produce therapeutic effects that exceed anything conventional medicine can explain. The neuroscientists who study experienced meditators find brain activity patterns that suggest forms of cognitive function that contemporary psychology does not recognize as possible. The physicists who examine consciousness-matter interactions encounter phenomena that require fundamental revisions to materialistic assumptions about the nature of reality. Yet these research findings remain marginalized within academic institutions that operate according to conceptual frameworks inherited from the Christian transformation of classical learning. The discoveries that challenge materialistic assumptions about consciousness and reality face the same systematic resistance that ancient wisdom traditions encountered from Christian authorities, though the mechanisms of suppression now operate through professional ostracism and funding restrictions rather than legal persecution and physical violence. The cultural DNA of the civilization that destroyed ancient wisdom continues to shape contemporary attitudes toward forms of knowledge that transcend orthodox academic boundaries. The epistemological habits that enabled the systematic elimination of pagan traditions persist in modern institutions that claim to pursue truth wherever investigation might lead, but actually operate within conceptual limitations that prevent serious consideration of ancient insights about consciousness, reality, and human potential. Standing in the ruins of the Serapeum, where desert sand has filled the halls where Hypatia once taught her students the mathematical principles underlying cosmic harmony, visitors can still see fragments of the astronomical instruments that priest scholars used to track planetary movements with precision that rivals modern calculations. The broken astrolabe lies half buried beneath stones that once formed part of a statue depicting the cosmos as ancient wisdom traditions understood it. Layer upon layer of conscious intelligences governing material processes through mathematical relationships that connect human psychology to celestial mechanics. These ruins tell a story that extends beyond the destruction of particular buildings or the elimination of specific religious traditions. They mark the place where humanity lost touch with dimensions of its own nature that earlier ages had considered essential to complete development, where entire sciences of consciousness vanished from human memory, where forms of understanding that had required centuries to develop disappeared in the space of a few generations. The silence that settles over these archaeological sites carries within it the echo of voices that once spoke with authority about realities that contemporary culture can barely imagine. The dust that covers ancient inscriptions holds traces of knowledge that assumed human beings possess capacities for development that modern civilization declares impossible. The broken instruments that lie scattered among fallen columns once served investigations into the nature of consciousness and reality that current academic disciplines cannot accommodate within their methodological frameworks. But in that silence, attentive listeners can sometimes detect sounds that suggest the old wisdom has not entirely disappeared. In the wind that moves through ruins of ancient temples, in the play of light across hieroglyphs that preserve fragments of Egyptian spiritual technology, in the geometric patterns that continue to appear in natural phenomena that ancient mathematicians studied as manifestations of divine intelligence, traces of the lost knowledge continue to communicate with those who have developed the sensitivity to perceive them. The earth itself remembers what human civilization has forgotten. The astronomical cycles that ancient calendars tracked continue to operate regardless of whether contemporary culture understands their significance. The consciousness development techniques that mystery schools perfected continue to produce their effects whenever modern practitioners rediscover and apply them properly. The ecological relationships that pre-Christian traditions honored as sacred manifestations of divine intelligence continue to function according to principles that traditional cultures understood, but that technological civilization systematically violates. In archives where contemporary scholars study the fragments of ancient wisdom that archaeological discoveries continue to yield, in laboratories where researchers investigate consciousness phenomena that materialistic science cannot explain, in spiritual communities where practitioners work to recover traditional approaches to human development, the patient effort to reconnect with lost knowledge continues. These contemporary recovery efforts face challenges that result directly from the systematic destruction that eliminated not just individual texts, but entire cultural frameworks that had supported ancient wisdom traditions. Modern attempts to understand ancient techniques must overcome conceptual barriers that were deliberately constructed to prevent such understanding. Institutional resistances that were systematically developed to eliminate alternative approaches to knowledge, and cultural amnesias that were carefully cultivated to ensure that pre-Christian insights could never again challenge Christian assumptions about the nature of reality and human possibility. Yet the continuing discoveries of buried texts, the persistent effectiveness of recovered techniques, and the growing recognition that ancient cultures possessed understanding that contemporary civilization lacks all suggest that the destruction, however systematic and thorough, could not entirely eliminate the wisdom that humanity had accumulated through millennia of careful investigation into the nature of consciousness and reality. The books they burned are gone forever, along with the teachers who understood them, the institutions that preserved them, and the cultures that gave them meaning. But the realities that those books described, the human capacities that those teachers developed, and the cosmic principles that those cultures recognized continue to exist, waiting for a civilization mature enough to rediscover what its ancestors once knew, patient enough to reconstruct what was destroyed, and wise enough to avoid repeating the catastrophe that eliminated so much human understanding from the world. In the ashes of ancient libraries, seeds of future wisdom lie dormant, ready to sprout when cultural conditions permit. When human consciousness expands enough to rediscover its own forgotten possibilities, when the long night of forgetfulness finally gives way to a dawn that illuminates not just new discoveries, but the recovery of ancient insights that can guide humanity toward forms of development that honor both its technological achievements and its spiritual potential.